Hi class, this is Dr. Liza Seigido. Welcome to this tutorial on how to control an analog synth or outboard digital synth with your DAW. Before moving on to the meat of this video, please make sure that you've read my Intro to MIDI article so that you have at least a rudimentary understanding of MIDI's channel system, which enables communication between MIDI-enabled devices. Also, your humble teacher is trying to promote traffic to her YouTube channel. If you want to help me out and have access to tons of music technology, audio, electronics, interactive media, and stage lighting tutorials, then please subscribe to my YouTube channel by clicking on the logo that appears on the bottom right side of this video. Okay, let's get started. Most of us turn to software instruments when we need interesting sounds in our productions. They're convenient. In Cakewalk, a free professional DAW for Windows computers, you simply drag and drop your virtual instruments into your track window. In Pro Tools, you create an instrument track and insert a software instrument. Now you're ready to record MIDI events into your instrument track using a MIDI keyboard, or if you're not a pianist, record MIDI events into a piano roll. Then you press play on your transport and hear your DAW play your virtual instrument. Cool beans. However, as you grow your project studio, you may be inclined to start working with analog synthesizers or outboard digital synthesizers or hybrid analog digital synthesizers, which can exponentially increase your sound design capabilities. This short tutorial will show you how to use MIDI channel system to get your DAW talking to one or more MIDI-capable outboard synthesizers. The first half of the tutorial will cover wiring, and the second half will cover DAW configuration. The first thing you need is an audio interface with MIDI ports. If your audio interface does not have MIDI ports, then you will need a MIDI interface. The second thing you need is a synthesizer with MIDI ports. Not all outboard synths have MIDI ports, so you have to make sure that your synth has at least a MIDI in port. A lot of outboard synths today are manufactured without MIDI through ports, which is problematic if you want to control more than one outboard synthesizer with your DAW. In the case that you want to control more than one synth with your DAW, and one or more of these synths do not have MIDI through ports, then you will need a MIDI through box or a MIDI splitter. Next, you need MIDI 5-pin DIN cables. The number of cables you need will depend on how many outboard synths you want to control with your DAW. The most basic wiring setup is the following. Using a MIDI 5-pin DIN cable, go from the MIDI out port of your master device, your audio interface or MIDI interface, and go into the MIDI in port of your synthesizer. If you want a second outboard synth in your sound arsenal, then you connect a MIDI cable from the MIDI through port of your first synthesizer to the MIDI in port of your second synthesizer. If your first synth doesn't have a MIDI through port, then you will need a MIDI through box or MIDI splitter, as mentioned above. Okay, so now your computer is physically connected to your outboard synth using MIDI 5-pin DIN cables. Now you need to tell your synth to accept MIDI data on channel 1. Most synths are set to respond to MIDI messages on channel 1 by default, so if you only want to control one outboard synth, then you're done with this step. However, if you have more than one outboard synth in your system, then you need to have each synth respond to a different MIDI channel. How do you set the MIDI channel on your outboard synth? Well, this depends on your synth, and you will need to read its manual to find out. You can send up to 16 channels of information over the MIDI output on your audio interface, which means that you are limited to 16 outboard instruments. If you want to control more than 16 outboard instruments, then you will need a MIDI interface with more than one out port. Quick FYI, most analog synths only respond to MIDI note on and note off messages, which means you can only control the pitches it produces with your DAW. However, some advanced analog synths like the Moog Subharmonicon can respond to MIDI continuous control change messages, which allows you to control its oscillators and filters with your DAW. You'll need to study its manual, however, to find out what MIDI CC is mapped to what oscillator or filter and how to configure the physical pots on the synth to enable your DAW to properly control these parameters with MIDI CCs. Your MIDI wiring is complete. However, you won't hear anything from your synth unless you have an audio cable going from your synth's line outputs into one of your audio interface's line inputs. If you have more than one synth, then you'll be using more than one line input on your audio interface. Okay, so now your synth is set to respond to MIDI data on channel 1. Now we have to get your DAW to send MIDI data to your synth and receive the audio from your synth. These instructions will help you navigate most industry standard DAWs. Step 1. Set up a MIDI track in your DAW. Instrument tracks work with software synths. MIDI tracks are designed to communicate with outboard synths. Step 2. Go to your DAW's preferences, navigate to the MIDI setup options, and select your audio interface as your MIDI output device. Again, if your audio interface doesn't have MIDI ports, then you'll need a MIDI interface, and you'll be selecting that as your MIDI output device. Step 3. Go to your newly created MIDI track and select your audio interface or MIDI interface as your MIDI output device. Step 4. This is very important. Somewhere on your MIDI track, either in Session View or in Mixer View, is a control that allows you to select your MIDI output channel. Our outboard synth is set to receive data on MIDI channel 1. Therefore, if we want this MIDI track to control that synth, then we need to set the MIDI output channel on this MIDI track to channel 1. In Cakewalk, which is the DAW you see on the screen, the output channel option for MIDI tracks is available in the track details on the left side of your screen. If you have more than one synth in your system, then you will need more than one MIDI track, with each set to a different MIDI channel. Make sure that the MIDI output channel of your tracks corresponds to the MIDI receive channels on your synthesizers. Step 5. Before you enter MIDI data into your MIDI track, you need to create an audio track to monitor and record the audio output from your synthesizer. Step 6. Go to your new audio track and select the input on your audio interface that corresponds to your synthesizer. Then record enable your audio track and click on the audio monitoring button. Now you'll be able to hear your synthesizer when you send it MIDI data. Step 7. Now it's time to record MIDI data for your synthesizer to perform. You can simply use a MIDI input device to enter data into your MIDI track. Make sure that you have a MIDI input device selected in your MIDI track. Or, if you're not a great pianist, you can enter MIDI data into your MIDI track's piano roll editor. You should hear your synth as you enter data into the piano roll. Step 8. Once you're done entering MIDI data, navigate to your DAW's transport and click on the record button. A waveform will appear in your audio track as piano roll scrubs through your MIDI sequence. Step 9. Repeat steps 3 through 8 if there is more than one outboard synth in your setup. Voila, you're done! You're controlling outboard synths with your DAW using MIDI's channel system. Please text me if you have any questions. My contact information is in the syllabus. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Chaito.